Hey guys, welcome to JPT. I'm Carson G, and this is Just Plain Tech. Now, today's video we are going to talk about switching to Linux, not why to switch to Linux. You can check out this video up here if you want to know why you should switch to Linux, but for those of you who have decided to make the switch to Linux, you'll probably look it up like Linux download, and you'll realize, wait a minute, Linux isn't just one operating system, it's way more. There are a ton of different Linux operating systems known as distributions. And you might be overwhelmed and you're like, okay. So what does all this mean? I have no idea. Well, I'm going to show you basically, I'm just going to explain some of the popular Linux distributions, some of the different Linux distributions, just a few of them. So most of you that have looked up Linux have probably came across something known as Ubuntu. So Ubuntu is a very great Linux distribution. It's actually the one I am running on this desktop computer right here. And I actually started out using Linux with Ubuntu 5 years ago. It was on a computer that my grandpa gave me. I started with Ubuntu. I know a lot of people that use Linux have started with Ubuntu, and honestly, I think a lot of you guys out here will decide to start with Ubuntu, so that's why I'm putting in this video first. Let's talk about some pros and cons of Ubuntu. Let's start with the pros. Most of these, I think all of these have more pros than cons, but let's talk about pros. Ubuntu comes ready-made. Oh, by the way, it's also really easy to install. I don't have it on the list, but it's very easy to install, and it comes ready to go. Right after you install it, you reboot into your computer, and bam, it's all ready. You just use it. No more configuring or anything like that. Everything's perfectly ready to go. So that's a really good pro. One other thing is that it comes with the Ubuntu software store, which is, basically it's a software store, and you can get all kinds of apps and games, whatever, and whatnot that you want on your computer through a graphical, of course, you could just install it through the terminal like this if you want to, but you can get it through a nice graphical store, kind of like you would on your phone. And if you haven't noticed already, its desktop environment and everything looks super cool. It's definitely very different from anything you'd use on a Windows or Mac-based computer, but yeah, it just has a really cool look and feel to it. And Ubuntu, this is the father of many Linux distributions. This is the base of many of the Linux distributions out there are based on this. So if all of the distributions are based off of Ubuntu, it must be pretty good. At least that's what I would think. Now, alright, so that's just scratching the surface of some of the pros. Let's go to cons. Con number one, and this is kind of a big one for those of you who have old computers. Those of you who have a newer computer like this one, it shouldn't matter too much, but Ubuntu 18.04 was, at least to my knowledge, the last version that supported 32-bit computers. So, and it didn't run very well on 32-bit computers. Mostly because to run this desktop environment and everything, you need at least 4 gig. I'd recommend at least 4 gigabytes of RAM. This computer has 8 gigabytes of RAM and it runs it stellarly, but I would recommend at least 4 gigabytes of RAM, definitely. And that's probably why they ended support, just because most 32-bit computers don't have 4 gigabytes of RAM, and most of them can only, even if you upgrade it, it can only support up to 4 gigabytes of RAM, so it's not the best experience. So if you have a 32-bit computer, you could get an older version of Ubuntu, but what I would recommend doing is getting a derivative of Ubuntu, such as Linux Mint, Puppy Linux, or Lubuntu, that will run on your computer. So, yeah. And another thing is, at least for me, this desktop environment was pretty much easy to get used to. This is where you view all your windows and stuff like that, and then you can switch workspaces, all that kind of stuff, and then here is where you just start and you pick an app here, and and here's the shelf. It's pretty much just like that. So it's not too hard to adjust to for me, but for some of you who aren't really super good with computers, it may take you a while to adjust to it. So with that being said, let's move on to Linux Mint, one of Ubuntu's many sons. So Linux Mint is based off of Ubuntu, and kind of like Ubuntu, Linux Mint does have its own software store, just like the one you saw on Ubuntu, but it's very revised, so it looks a little bit differently, and so yeah, it's just a revised software store pretty much. Linux Mint, like Ubuntu, just comes with GNOME. Linux Mint, on the other hand, you have a choice of desktop environments. You have Cinnamon, which I'd recommend for those of you who like a high-techy feel for your desktop, and you have a more powerful computer with at least 4 gigabytes of RAM. And there's also Mate and Xface, or it's really XFCE, but to me, I just read it as Xface. So Mate and Xface, they're both really lightweight, and they'll run on just about any computer. Now Linux Mint 20 is kind of like Ubuntu 18.04. It doesn't support, Ubuntu 18.04 and later. So just like Ubuntu, Linux Mint doesn't support 32-bit anymore. It does, but the newer versions don't. So Linux Mint 19.3 Trisha is the last version that supports 32-bit computers, but that's still supported until 2023, I think, or maybe 2025, I'm not sure. 2023, I'm pretty sure, yeah. So that's still supported, but the latest versions don't support 32-bit. And another thing is with Ubuntu, you might notice that there's long-term support versions and something's not. By the way, if you're gonna get Ubuntu, I'd recommend getting a long-term support version. But Linux Mint, actually, all of the versions of Linux Mint are long-term support, so you don't have to worry. You just choose one, pretty much. So let's talk about cons. Linux Mint, it's much easier to adjust to the desktop environment, regardless of which one you use. It's so much easier to adjust than it is to adjust to Ubuntu. But Linux Mint, it has a little bit of configuring to do, not much, and it's generally easy. But for those of you who aren't super tech savvy, maybe you had someone else install it for you, it may be a little weird to configure it at first. Basically, you just need to set the update manager and select a mirror. It's not that much work. So yeah. So with that being said, let's move on to Debian. So Debian, remember how I said Ubuntu is the father of all Linux distributions? Debian is like the grandpa of all Linux distributions. Ubuntu is based off Debian, and Debian is just kind of, I don't know if it's based off anything, but basically Debian is that one Linux distribution that almost all the rest of them are based off of. So in one way or another, like Linux Mint, in a way, is based off Debian, because it's based off of Ubuntu, which is based off Debian. So in a way, it's a Debian-based Linux distribution. That's what people consider it as. So Debian has lots of desktop environments you can choose from when you're installing it. I think it's like 6 or 7 or something like that. But my point is, it has a lot. Now that is a pro, you get choice, but it's also a con, because it can be kind of overwhelming. You don't know which desktop environment you want to choose, and some desktop environments have like a graphical store, such as the Ubuntu Software Center. It's probably called something different, but it's pretty much the same thing. And some of them don't. However, the ones that don't, you can still use, the terminal, or you could use Synaptic Package Manager, which is a graphical package manager as well that they also come with. Alright, and unlike Ubuntu, Debian fully supports Linux distributions. Debian fully supports 32-bit computers to this day. So the latest version of Debian will run just fine, no problem, on your 32-bit computer, as long as you choose a low-end desktop environment like Mate or Xface or LXDE or LXQT. So yeah, so it does support that. let's talk about some cons. Never mind, I already said that. Alright, moving on. Another Linux distribution that I think is, I know it's a Debian-based Linux distribution, but I think it directly came from Linux Mint. I think it's directly based off Linux Mint, that a lot of you may like. It's not as heard of, but I use it and I really like this Linux distribution on this computer. It's called Feren OS. Now, let's talk about pros of Feren OS. It's based off Ubuntu, and like Linux Mint, it has, it's an Ubuntu-based Linux distribution, and like Linux Mint, it has a revised software store, but this software store has full support for Flatpak applications. So, yeah, you can install, not only can you install stuff from apt, but you can also install Flatpaks too. So, this is what I think I think this might attract a lot of you. It has a really, really beautiful desktop environment. It's a modified version of KDE. A lot of you might know KDE 5 as being like, you Linux experts might think KDE 5 is bloated or, stuff like that. But it's a very de-bloated version of KDE 5, and it's laid out very differently, so it's heavily modified, but it's for the better. It's very de-bloated, very fast, and just it has a very nice look and feel to it, and animations and everything. It's just so beautiful, and honestly, I love it. It's a really great Linux distribution to live with your computer. It's a really great Linux distribution to have on your computer, and it really makes your computer like high tech. So that's really cool. Let's talk about some cons. Con number one, this Linux distribution has absolutely no 32-bit support, only 64-bit. So if you have a 32-bit computer, not gonna work. So only 64-bit computers. Most of you, that shouldn't be a problem, since I am one of the only people I know that still have like 32-bit laptops that I use daily. So yeah, for most of you that probably won't be a problem. But kind of like Ubuntu, I'd recommend at least 4 gigabytes of RAM to run, probably 6 or 8 gigabytes if you want to run it at top speed. Alright, now let's move on to those of you with the older computers and you're disappointed about the 32-bit support and everything. Fear not! There is still hope. Even if your computer only has like 512 megabytes of onboard RAM, which is, believe it or not, even lower than all of my computers that I have. But say you only have 512 megabytes of RAM, there is still hope for your computer. And it will probably still work on the internet too. Internet browsing and stuff like that. Maybe not YouTube, but you could get SMTube. For those of you who have older computers and you kind of want to watch YouTube on them, check this out. You can actually install a software on Linux that will help you view YouTube videos on your old computers. I use it with my Acer Aspire 1 ZG5, and for those of you who know what that is, it's a very old computer that, well, its specs sucks. Its specs suck, to say the least. But I got it running really well on Linux and with SMTube, and it is really nice, and I'm actually proud of the experience. Anyway, let's talk about Puppy Linux. Pros. It runs on computers with extremely low RAM. Like, we're talking about 512 megabytes or less. It will run very well. I would recommend this Linux distribution for literally any old computer you have. Literally, if it's an old computer, it must run Puppy Linux. Since it's so small, it can actually run straight from your RAM. And we all know that the RAM is faster than the hard drive. So that way your operating system will be faster if it's running off the RAM than it will be running from the hard drive. So, and since it's not using the hard drive as much, if you have like a HDD that's like squeaking or something and you can tell it's starting to fail, or that's like squeaking a lot, or you have a bad hard drive or like a faulty hard drive, it will take it, since it's running from RAM the whole time, it will take it really easy on your hard drive, making it last longer, and it's really just more reliable than something running straight from your hard drive if that's your case. It only takes up about 300 megabytes of RAM on your hard drive on a fresh install. So you could use this with a computer with like 4 gigabytes of internal space. So that's really nice. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope this video helped you decide which Linux distribution you want to use with your computer. If you have any comments or questions, just drop them down in the comment section below and I'll try to help you out as best I can. Thank you guys so much for watching. See you next time.